Here. I'm Courtney Freer. I'm a research officer at the Kuwait program here at the LSE. And I work on domestic politics of the Gulf, so I'm completely out of my depth here tonight, but looking forward to hearing from our speakers. So we'll go ahead and have them speak for about maybe 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll go ahead and have question and answer period after that. If you'd like to tweet at any time during the event, you can use the hashtag LSE images. And so I guess I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers. We have Shireen Al-Faqi, who's the author of Sex in the Citadel, an Intimate Life in a Changing Arab World. She's formerly a journalist with The Economist and a presenter with Al Jazeera. And Shireen is also a professor of global practice at the Monk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto and an associate fellow at Chatham House. She's currently leading Images MENA, a pioneering study of men, masculinities, and gender equality across the Arab region. After she speaks, we'll hear from Joy Ayoub, who is a Lebanese writer, as well as a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh, researching the politics of post-war Lebanese cinema. In addition, he's the regional editor at Global Voices for the MENA region and founder of the blog Hummus for Thought. So I'll go ahead and let Shireen get started. Thanks for joining us.
Right. Many thanks, Courtney, and my thanks to the LSE Middle East Center for hosting tonight's discussion. It's one of the great, or actually one of the great, but also one of the many paradoxes of our region, that men are the pillars of our patriarchies, but we actually know relatively little about what's happening in their personal lives, in their intimate lives, how they see their role in the world and the changing position of particularly women and girls around them. And one of the reasons for this relative lack of research into men and masculinities in the Arab region is because gender, as conventionally defined in our region, has distinctly female features. The vast majority of policies and programs and research is focused on women and girls, and rightly so, because women and girls are on the receiving end of constriction, regulation, control, whether at the level of law, at the level of society, or within the family. But if we want to engage men, if we want to bring them up to speed with a changing world of gender roles and rights, then we do need to begin to speak to them to understand how they see the changing world around them. And in the absence of this information, there is a lot of speculation. And I'll give you just two examples. Some of you may recall the infamous Foreign Policy, a cover of 2012, Why Do They Hate Us?, which paints men as, basically misogynistic oppressors of women. Fast forward to this year, and last week, Beatrix von Storch, a deputy leader of the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, released a tweet castigating the police in Cologne for daring to present a New Year's Eve greeting in Arabic, suggesting that, or criticizing them for appeasing the brutal Muslim rapist hordes of men. So we have a lot of heat about men in and from our region, but not a lot of light, and this is the light. We call it Images, the International Men and Gender Equality Survey in the Middle East and North Africa. Images is a global study. It was created in 2008 by an NGO with which I work called Promundo, which is focused on engaging men and boys on questions of gender equality, including the diminution of sexual and gender-based violence. And Promundo works in about 20 countries around the world. And the survey was created in conjunction with the International Center for Research on Women in DC. It is a multi-country, multi-year initiative to try to understand men's and women's attitudes and behaviors. It consists of a household survey and also companion qualitative research. And to date, the study has been done in more than 30 countries with more than 60,000 male and female respondents. And this map just gives you a sense of the breadth of the study, which has been done across the Americas, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. And the countries we're going to be focusing on today are Morocco, Egypt, Lebanon, and very tiny Palestine, which is where the first wave of this study, Images MENA, has been conducted. So in our survey, we talked to about 1,200 men and 1,200 women in each country in the quantitative household survey, and then we talked to further samples in our qualitative research. As you can see from this table, we had really high response rates. One of the concerns of our local research partners, because these surveys were conducted by researchers in country who come from the communities, was that, will we be able to get men to talk? Our problem wasn't getting men to start talking, it was getting them to stop talking, basically. And this is because in many cases they have never, ever been asked questions of this nature and trying to understand what is really happening in their lives. So that was a very gratifying and unexpected finding for our teams. The survey was conducted the actual field work was done between April of last year, April 2016 and March 2017. The standard images questionnaire, which has been fielded around the world, has a lot of questions that were not deemed suitable for the Arab region, either because of official government censorship or the sensitivities, that there was a feeling amongst the research teams that they wouldn't be able to get honest answers in the setting of a household survey. For people who come from the region, who work in the region, you know these sensitive areas. These are the 3 red lines: religion, politics, and especially sex. So a lot of these topics, particularly related to sexuality, we took out of the household survey and put into qualitative research, in-depth interviews, and focus group discussions. More interesting than the subjects we omitted were the new subjects that were introduced in conjunction, in consultation with our local research partners, but also with local NGOs working on questions of gender roles and rights, the new topics that they really felt needed to be explored in depth with men and women in order to promote policy change and inform new programming on the ground. Among those topics were we introduced a new module on female genital mutilation in Egypt for the first time, talking to men not just about their attitudes towards FGM, but their involvement in decision-making around FGM. And there's some very interesting findings there, which I hope we can discuss later. We looked in Palestine, we looked in depth at the impact of a political occupation, a political repression, occupation in Palestine, and its connection, so the connection between sort of general and public violence and the connection to domestic violence. We looked at the effects of conflict in Lebanon, particularly amongst Palestinian and Syrian refugee populations, how the experience of conflict and displacement had changed gender roles within families. We introduced new modules on marriage and divorce, on migration, on honor and honor-related violence, and also on sexual harassment, sexual assault in public spaces. In Lebanon and Palestine, our samples, our 2,400 people, were nationally representative samples, with the limitation in Lebanon in that there is no census in Lebanon, and so it is very hard to understand what is truly nationally representative in the country. In Egypt, we interviewed men and women in 5 urban and rural governorates. And in Morocco, we talked to men and women in 1 region, Rabat Saleh Kenitra, which generally represents the diversity of Morocco, with the exception that it's a slightly more urban population than the country as a whole. In every country, it's men interviewing men and women interviewing women. And we only ever talk to 1 respondent per household for clear ethical reasons. In Egypt and Morocco, we used handheld computers to collect the data, also in Lebanon. In Palestine, because of sensitivity around computer data collection and the occupation, we used paper questionnaires. And as I mentioned, in every country, we had qualitative research done, and the qualitative research differed from country to country. That was very much dictated by the local research partners and the topics of priority to them. Images is vast. It takes about an hour to complete the survey, and it is covering the lives of men and women in what we think to be almost 360-degree perspective. We're looking at men's and women's support for gender equality in public and private life. We talk about household relations, what happened when you were a boy or a girl, what did your mother do in the house, what did your father do, who made the decisions, what did you do as a son, what did you do as a daughter, how were your experiences as children different from each other. We look at violence, the drivers and disruptors of gender-based violence in public and private spaces. We have modules on health and well-being, and we also look at stress, in particular, the impact of displacement, conflict, and economic pressures on men's psychological well-being. Huge amounts of data. This is just a snapshot, and I'm very happy to pick up other points of interest in the Q&A session. Okay, so to begin, some of the data. One of the clear take-home messages from our study is just how much pressure these men are under. There is this impression that because of the patriarchy, it's fantastic for men. If you are at the top of the patriarchy, life is rather good in many countries in our region, and most of the people at the top of the patriarchy tend to be men. But down below are women and lots of men. And for those men who are not at the top of that pyramid, life is very tough, and this is what they told us. This data shows men who are responding yes to whether they are frequently stressed or depressed because of a lack of work or income, because they sometimes feel ashamed to face their family due to a lack of work or income, or they worry about providing their family with daily necessities. And as you'll see, the percentages who are really under the gun, as it were, are ranging from about 40% in Egypt, Morocco slightly less, but up to about half of men in Palestine. And in Palestine in particular, we did this survey in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and also in Gaza. So we had a full range of experience reflected, and these men are under pressure. This pressure manifests itself in different ways, but this is just one reflection. This is a measure of depressive symptoms. We use a standardized scale from the WHO, and as you'll see, about a quarter of men are actually qualifying as depressed according to this scale, and about half of women. And I have to say, I presented this data at Chatham House last year when an eminent Arab journalist said to us, "Good heavens, only a quarter of men and half of women depressed? I call that a success." But this is worrying, because also we ask questions about whom do you go to if you are feeling under pressure. And the women are mainly speaking to other women in the family, and the men are mainly speaking to their wives. But no one, virtually no one is seeking external help because of a lot of the stigma associated with psychiatry and psychological treatment in our region. But again, these are men and women who are feeling the strain. In each section a thematic section of data that I'm going to present to you, I'm going to take a deep dive into one country. These questions were asked in all countries, but this is just to show you, in particular, for here in Lebanon. And this is really quite alarming. When we asked men, do you fear for your safety? Do you fear for your family's safety? Do you worry about the future for yourself and your family? Basically, all men are anxious. And this was true in the three other countries in which we did this survey. And this data in Lebanon is a composite of Syrian refugees and also Lebanese nationals. But when we disaggregated the data, they were both feeling the pressure. And in the qualitative studies, we also add nuance to these numbers. And this is a quotation from a Lebanese man in one of our focus group discussions when he was talking about what happens to men when they can't get jobs, which is a problem for many men, particularly younger men in our region, because of the double-digit unemployment levels, which have a number of have had a number of consequences, including the uprisings of the Arab Spring. But this Lebanese man said, when a man doesn't have work, he becomes like a tissue, very easily breakable. In normal times, he is like steel, but when he cannot fulfill his duties, he becomes very fragile. So these men are clearly feeling the pressure in private life. So what's happening? How is this reflected in their attitudes towards gender roles and rights in the public domain? So we ask a wide range of questions to try to gauge attitudes towards gender equality, and this slide just shows two of them. On the left, you see we're asking about support for this statement. The idea that men and women are equal is not part of our traditions and culture. And as you say, majorities of men on the left and also majorities of women believe that this is not something which is an indigenous part of their country's social traditions. But when we ask, on the right-hand side, more rights for women mean that men lose out, it's quite interesting. More than 50% of men simply disagree with that. They don't see more rights for women as a zero-sum game, basically. And this is very important because it actually does show that there is room to maneuver. There is room. There is openness to change and to be considering other ways of gender roles and rights. And you'll see this in the data in many places, that it's a mixed bag. On one hand, we have what seem to be quite conservative attitudes, but on the other hand, there are surprisingly open attitudes as well. Right, this is a series of questions. It's part of a much larger collection of questions which we use to calculate something called the Gender Equitable Men's Scale, the so-called GEM scale, which is a measure of openness towards gender equality. The important thing here is not the particular questions, but just a point I want to draw out. And the message here is that it's not just men who are propping up the patriarchy, it's women as well. And I'll show you would give you two examples. If you look at the bottom line, it's a man's duty to exercise guardianship over his female relatives. And you look to the far right, which is Palestine. So 80% of men agree with this, but almost 2/3 of women are also in agreement. And if you look at the top, a woman's most important role is to take care of the home and cook for the family. You know, a whopping 87% of men think that's a jolly good idea. But also 3/4 of women are in agreement with that. Here you'll see what really comes to the crux of some of the issues related to gender equality in the public domain. Over on the left, we ask the question, if resources are scarce, it is more important to educate sons than daughters. As you know, we've had tremendous success in many countries, in most countries in the Arab region, in getting women into a formal education. And in some parts of our region, I'm sure Courtney can speak to this, in the Gulf states, we actually have more women in higher education than we have men, and women are doing better in school, in education. And as you see, this is reflected in this data. The majority of men actually have no problem. They don't prioritize boys' education over girls' education. The problem is when you try to transfer education into employment. So if you look on the right, this is one of the standard questions that's also asked in the World Values Survey. When work opportunities are scarce, men should have access to jobs before women. Yes, well, 98% of men in Egypt are in agreement with that, but also strong majorities in most of our countries of women also believe this to be the case. And this lies at the heart of what was called the employment paradox in the Arab region. Again, we have these very high rates of female education, but only about 1/4 on average of women across our region are in the formal workforce. And that's, if you compare that to the average for the global south of 40%, we are really lagging behind. And there are many reasons for that, but some of them are down to these sort of attitudes. We asked in every country about the role of women as leaders in society. And Morocco is an interesting example because, of course, they've seen a lot of legal change since 2004 and the reform of their family law code for women, instituting women's rights. So when we ask men and women, for example, there should be more women in positions of political authority, women are too emotional to be leaders, a woman with the same qualifications can do as good a job as a man, the men are very supportive of women in public space. I should point out, we also asked men if how comfortable they feel working with women as lower-level colleagues at the same level, and more than 50% of men actually said that they would accept to work with a female boss, which was really quite surprising, although it's possible that in their minds that's about as likely as, I don't know, Egypt winning the World Cup. But still, there is an openness to seeing women in positions of authority. But it's a balancing act, because on the one hand, while they say that they're open towards this empowerment, on the other hand, they feel a tension with what is happening in private life. And to give you an example here, a man in his 20s, a student near Rabat, said, "To be honest, it's rare to find a real man. The man has lost his masculinity with these new laws that give more advantages and freedom to women." And from women, we heard the complexity, the contradiction they saw between having this change in the public domain and how it wasn't really translating into private life. And this from a woman who's 30 years old, who's a teacher in Rabat. Honestly, the rhetoric on the rights of women, nothing like that exists. It's only talk. In Moroccan families and households, we still live by tradition. We have a culture that can't be remade in a moment. As I mentioned, we had an extensive series of questions looking at violence in the public and private space, and here's some of this data. We looked at violence in childhood, and what was interesting is that we uncovered just the very high levels of violence that not just women are experiencing, but also men. And if you look at this slide, this is showing data when we talked to respondents of whether they had experienced at least one of 3 acts of physical violence, which includes shoving, pushing, beating with an object at home before the age of 18. And it's really quite remarkable. You're looking at more than half of men who have experienced physical violence at home. And when we talked to them about violence in schools, it was really terrifying. Up to 80% of men in some countries said that they had been beaten by a teacher. And this data has real implications because when we look further on at the prevalence or the likelihood of committing domestic violence, intimate partner violence, or sexual harassment, it was the men who had experienced violence in childhood who were more likely to go on to be violent towards their partners in adulthood. Again, not a unique finding in the Arab region, but nonetheless a disturbing one. When we looked at spousal control, so we asked men, do you want to know where your wife is all the time? Do you control what she wears? Do you control when she goes out and when you have sexual relations? And basically 100% of men said they control everything. And again, not a uniquely Arab finding. But it's interesting, and the women also agreed with this, like this level of spousal control. But what was interesting is when we started talking about some of the nuance of household decision making. For example, who decides whether the sons get married, the girls get married, the children go to school, who decides on major purchases in the household. The men basically said, well, we make the decisions. And the women said, well, They said, we actually make the decisions, but very often we present it in a way that he thinks he has made the decision. And I know this from my own family. My grandmother, my Egyptian grandmother was very much in control of the household, but she made it seem as if my grandfather was calling the shots. And my Egyptian grandmother used to have she had many proverbs, most of which I can't actually cite here because they are a little robust. But one of them is a clever woman can spin yarn with a donkey's thigh bone. By that meaning that women can get what they want, they just have to go about it in a rather more circuitous way. But this spousal control is translating into some very serious, alarming rates of domestic violence. Now here we're using standard scales, looking at different types of intimate partner violence, different types of physical violence, emotional violence, sexual violence, and economic violence. I'm just presenting two sets here. And I also need to point out that in other parts of the world in which images has been conducted, we ask questions of unmarried people as well. That was just not on the cards in the Arab region. We couldn't get permission to do that. So when we talk about intimate partner here, we're talking about spouses. But if you look on the left-hand side, this is looking at the percentage of ever married men and women who either have perpetrated or experienced at least one form of spousal violence. And these rates in Egypt, for example, are extremely high. I mean, these are some of the highest rates we've seen. These are close to the rates that we've been seeing in some conflict-afflicted countries in Central Africa. So there's clearly problems at home in terms of physical spousal violence. And if you look over here on emotional violence, those levels are through the roof in some of our countries. We also looked at sexual harassment, clearly a topic of considerable interest both at home in the region but also abroad. This is the percentage of men who have committed types of sexual harassment against women and women who have experienced it. And as you see in Egypt and Morocco, for example, the men, he said, she said, is fairly closely aligned. In Egypt in particular, about 65% of men and women have either perpetrated or experienced street-based violence. And to give you a sense of some of the qualitative work that we did on this, this is a quote from a woman who living in Cairo. She's in her late 20s. She said, "My husband beat me. When I complained to his family, they said, 'What do you expect? Do you want him to take his frustration out on people on the street or in his home? You should tolerate your husband.' But my brothers got angry and kept me in my parents' home and said that I should not go home to him. I stayed 3 months with my mother until my husband realized his mistake and understood that by beating me, he had lost his wife and children. But even then, when his mother came to visit, she tried to convince him that I was wrong. She expects me to be a sponge that soaks up his anger and frustration." So in the interest of time, I'll just conclude here. And as I said, I look forward to discussing these findings further. But just to give you some sort of overarching themes from this survey. Men at work, it's very clear that men are defining themselves first and foremost as breadwinners, and the women in their lives are defining them as such. And when they can't reach that milestone, when they can't attain that sense of self, it's bubbling over into frustration. Like father, like son. As I said, the importance of fatherhood in shaping attitudes and practices. I mentioned a little bit about the boys who had experienced violence, who went on to perpetrate it. But interestingly, the flip side is also true. The men who were more likely to share decision-making with their wives, or were willing to get their hands dirty in doing traditionally female tasks like cooking and cleaning, these are the ones who had seen their fathers do the same with their mothers. The fairer sex, as I mentioned, women's attitudes in our survey were often as or more conservative than those of men, and those in particular were related to control of their own sexuality. So to give you just one example, in the sexual harassment data, we also asked for motivations for sexual harassment, and we asked about attitudes towards sexual harassment. And one of the standard questions that's asked is that women who are provocatively dressed deserve to be harassed. Well, about 3/4 of men in Egypt agreed with that statement, but almost 90% of women also believe that to be the case. So there's a lot of self-regulation as evinced in this survey by women as relates to their own sexuality. One of the most interesting findings in our survey is what we call the youth gap. Almost everywhere else in the world that we've done images, when we look at young men's attitudes, all those questions I showed about the gender equitable men scale, young men are more open on women's roles and rights than older generations, except in the Arab region, where we found that younger men were as or even more conservative than older men, but younger women were more open than their mothers and grandmothers. So we have a situation in which young men are moving in one direction and young women are moving in the other, to be discussed in the Q&A. The gap between attitudes and actions. Very often we found, particularly in the qualitative work, there were indeed men who were actually breaking the mold and engaged in childcare and domestic work, contrary to the prevailing gender norms. But in many cases, these men were not doing it out of some sort of grand ideological stance on gender equality. They were doing it because they have to, because circumstances have dictated this. And in particular, this was true of Syrian refugee men whom we interviewed, who just had found their world completely upended, because in displacement it had actually turned out to be easier for the women folk, as it were, their wives and their daughters, to actually go out and get small jobs, and that they were left at home to pick up the slack there. The tension between the public and the private. So as I mentioned, very often men and women would talk about their support for changes in laws and practices related to gender equality, but also in particular the women wondering, well, what good is this doing me at home? If great, I can go out and I work all day, and then I come home and I work all night because my husband isn't doing anything. I have to bear this double burden. And to give you an illustration of the public versus private divide, there was an Egyptian woman who said to us, yes, in our household, my husband does the laundry because we've just got this new washing machine. and it's very shiny, and it's very expensive, and it's very technical. So he does the washing, but he never puts the laundry out to dry because it's the line that's on the balcony, and then the neighbors would see. So it's a very personal, it's a very personal illustration of what we are seeing across the board, this gap between the public and the private. Finally, many men and women in our study talked about what they called to be, what they said was the crisis of masculinity. That basically we know that the old models aren't working anymore, but we're not sure where we're heading. But we actually prefer to think of it as a crossroads, because it is very clear that there is at least a minority of men, about 30 to 40%, and on any given issue are thinking differently, acting differently, and they are the cornerstone of change. And now that we've done this survey under the aegis of UN Women, the study findings are now being translated into practice by NGOs across the region that are now starting to engage with men and boys where they once only worked with women and girls. And I want to conclude with just one example of that sort of engagement. This is a commercial that went out on Egyptian TV based on the images data around the launch of our study in Egypt. It was picked up by Mohammed Saleh and tweeted to the world, so it's actually gained some traction in the Arab region. It's in Arabic with subtitles, so I'll play it now. No, I won't. Let's see. Here we go.
لأني راجل باخد براحتي. لأني راجل بعمل اللي أنا عايزه. لأني راجل بخاف عليا من الشارع. خليها قاعدة في البيت طبعا. شغل البيت مسؤولية الست. وهي طول النهار قاعدة. الراجل يتعب في شغله. وهي إيه اللي هيشغلها؟ هي تربي العيال. أنا بجيب فلوس لأني راجل. أنا بربي الواد كده عشان يطلع لأبوه. لأن أبوه راجل. مفيش بنت تلعب رياضة. أنا أهلي ربوني على كده. لأني راجل قررت أكسر الدايرة دي. شجعت بنتي تستمر في الرياضة لحد ما بقت بطلة. ساعدتها في تربية الأولاد عشان تاخد فرصتها في شغلها. بشاركها في شغل البيت ومقدر المجهود اللي
Again, the washing machine.
اهتميت بتعليم أختي لحد ما بقت دكتورة. مؤمن بقدرات زميلاتي وواثق فيهم. لأني راجل قدرت دورها في المجتمع. لأني راجل شاب واجهت العنف ضد المرأة. لأني راجل عنده مروءة اهتميت إنها تاخد حقها وفهمت إن الراجل والست ليهم نفس الحقوق والواجبات. لأني راجل.
And finally, the study in its full 300-page Technicolor splendor is available at this website, imagesmena.org. Many thanks.